This is important. What I'm about to show you took me 20 years to piece together. Spinoza saw it 400 years ago. The church tried to destroy it. Don't click away until you've seen the evidence.
There is a clay tablet in the British Museum, pressed before Genesis was written. A baby in a reed basket, sealed with bitumen, set on a river, found by a stranger, raised to rule. His name was not Moses. Spinoza discovered why this tablet has been hidden from you. Room 52 in the British Museum, the Near Eastern Antiquities section. If you have ever been there, you know the particular quality of the silence, not the reverential hush of a church, but the denser quiet of things older than religion. Stone objects behind glass, labels in small print. Most visitors walk through quickly, looking for Egypt next door. The tablet I want to tell you about is not prominently displayed. It rarely is. It is a fragment of cuneiform clay, or rather 4 fragments, catalogued as K3401 in the museum's collection. It dates from the Neo-Assyrian period, somewhere between 900 and 600 years before the Common Era. The clay itself is the color of dried earth after rain. The cuneiform script runs in tight wedge-shaped rows across its surface. And pressed into that clay in a language that had already been old for 1,000 years is this: "My mother was a changeling. My father I knew not. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he dipped his bucket. Aki raised me to be his son. He set me to his garden work. And while I worked in the garden, the goddess Ishtar granted me her love, and for 54 years I exercised kingship." The man describing his birth is Sargon of Akkad. He lived approximately 2,334 years before the Common Era. He was the founder of the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in recorded human history, stretching across what is now Iraq and Syria. He was not a minor figure. He was the template from which the very concept of empire was drawn. Now, you know a story that begins with a basket, rushes, bitumen, a river, a stranger who pulls a child from the water, a child raised in a house of power, a child who will become the liberator of his people. You have known that story since childhood, most likely. It is in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, a basket of bulrushes, sealed with pitch, with bitumen, set among the reeds at the river's edge. Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket. She keeps the child. She names him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. The structural mirror between these two texts is visible the moment you place them side by side. But the date on that tablet, the date on tablet K3401, tells a story that the institutional church has never wanted to examine with full honesty. Before I tell you what that date means, I need you to understand something. I have spent time with that tablet, not a reproduction, the actual object. And what Spinoza understood 3.5 centuries ago, when he was working alone in Amsterdam, forbidden from publishing, knowing exactly what he had found, that is what I want to show you. Before I show you the 8 elements, I need you to hear one thing. Spinoza's method, the method he developed in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, was not about hostility to Scripture. It was about reading it honestly. Read it the way you would read any ancient document. Who wrote it, for what audience, in what historical context, and for what purpose? Ask those questions genuinely, without the protective frame of what you were taught to find, and something very specific begins to happen. The text stops being eternal. It starts being human. And human things have dates. Let me give you the 8 elements first. Then we can talk about what they mean. Element 1. Birth in circumstances that require concealment. In the Sargon legend, his mother is a changeling who cannot acknowledge the child. In Exodus, Moses is born during Pharaoh's decree that all Hebrew male infants must be killed. In both cases, the child's birth is dangerous. The child must be hidden. Element 2. A basket made of reeds. Not a wooden cradle, not a clay vessel, not a hollowed log. Reeds, woven rushes. In both texts, the specific material is named. Element 3. Bitumen as waterproofing. This is the detail that stops you when you see it clearly. Bitumen is not the obvious material for sealing a small basket. You might use wax, you might use animal fat. Bitumen, a natural petroleum-based tar, is a highly specific substance. In Akkadian it is kupru. In Hebrew it is zift, different languages, the same substance, named in both texts. That level of specificity is not the fingerprint of coincidence. It is the fingerprint of a common source. Element 4, placement on a river. Not a lake, not a sea. A river with current, with movement, with direction. A river that could carry something. Element 5, the basket is found by someone with power or proximity to power. In the Sargon text by Akkad, the royal drawer of water, a man in the employ of the court. In Exodus by Pharaoh's own daughter. Element 6, the child is adopted and raised. Not sent away, not examined, not returned. Taken in, raised as though the child were their own. Element 7, the child is raised inside a structure of authority, a royal household, a palace, a position of privilege. Sargon tends the royal garden. Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house. Element 8, the child becomes a leader. Not simply successful, not merely respected, a ruler, a liberator, a king, someone whose greatness is, in retrospect, made inevitable by the very sequence of events that began with the basket. 8 elements, same sequence, specific materials named identically, in texts from 2 different civilizations, in 2 different languages, separated by geography and by time. I was standing in the Near Eastern Antiquities room when I first understood this properly. Not when I first read about it. I had read about it years before, in a footnote in a secondary source. But there is a difference between knowing something as information and knowing it as a thing you are standing in front of. The tablet was smaller than I expected. That sounds trivial, but it matters somehow. Objects of that historical weight tend to expand in the imagination until you see them, and then they correct themselves back to their actual dimensions. Palm-sized, 4 fragments reassembled under glass. The cuneiform was dense and regular, and utterly indifferent to what it contained. The clay did not know what it had done. The afternoon light in that room is indirect and slightly cold. The stone floor carries the chill upward through your shoes. I was holding my notebook, and I was not writing in it. I was just reading the tablet, holding in my mind what I had read in translation. And the moment was not dramatic. It was not a revelation in the sense of light and certainty. It was more like watching furniture shift into a position it had always been meant to occupy in a room where, for years, something had been subtly wrong. Everything was now where it should be. And that correctness was the thing that settled in me permanently. Not astonishment, which passes, but something more like the end of a confusion I hadn't known I was carrying. These are not surface similarities. They are 8 specific structural elements in the same sequence, in texts from 2 different civilizations. And that is the moment Spinoza's method becomes relevant. But before I explain what Spinoza made of this, you need to understand the date problem. Because the date problem is the key to everything. Let me be precise about the timeline, because precision is what makes this argument stand rather than fall. Sargon of Akkad lived approximately from 2334 to 2279 years before the Common Era. That is established historical record. He was real. His empire was real. Excavations at Akkadian sites have confirmed the historical basis for his reign. But his birth legend, the basket, the river, Akkad, the river that rose not over him, was not written down in his own time. The tablets we have, including K3401 in the British Museum, are Neo-Assyrian copies. They date from somewhere between 900 and 600 years before the Common Era. Some scholars believe they were commissioned under Sargon II of Assyria, a different man, ruling from 722 to 705 BC, who deliberately adopted the ancient name to claim the prestige of the original. A king commissioning a miraculous birth story for himself, using the literary tools his culture had ready to hand. This matters for the Moses comparison in a very specific way. Exodus, in its current compiled form, is generally dated by academic scholars, including those working from the documentary hypothesis, which Spinoza effectively anticipated 200 years before it was formally developed. to the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, not earlier. The Yahwist and Elohist sources that were combined into the Pentateuch as we have it were likely brought into something like their final form during or shortly after the Babylonian exile. The exile began in 587 BC when Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Jerusalem and deported significant portions of the Judean population to Babylon. Now, the Israelites spent decades in Babylon, in the very heartland of Mesopotamian literary and cultural tradition. Babylon was not a remote posting. It was the intellectual and cultural capital of the ancient Near East. Babylonian libraries, Babylonian scribes, Babylonian myths, including the Sargon birth legend, which was part of the living literary repertoire of the Mesopotamian world that surrounded the exiles on every side. In 1980, a scholar named Brian Lewis published a study cataloging what he called the exposed hero myths of the ancient Near East. When he finished, he had identified 72 separate examples, 72 narratives following the same basic pattern: a child of significance, placed in danger, preserved by water or wilderness, raised by adoptive hands, destined to lead. The template was not unique to Sargon. It was a genre with recognizable conventions that ancient audiences would have identified as immediately as a modern reader identifies a detective story. Moses fits that genre precisely. And Moses, if Lewis's count was right, would be number 73. What I am about to show you is the kind of evidence that rearranges the architecture of what you thought you knew. Not what you believe as a matter of faith. That is your own, and I have no interest in disturbing it. But what you were told to believe as history, as established fact, as something that required no further investigation. That is a different matter entirely, and it is the matter Spinoza spent his working life addressing. In the next section, I want to show you what Spinoza actually did with this kind of evidence, because his method is not what most people assume when they hear his name in a religious context. He was not trying to destroy the Bible. He was doing something more disruptive than that. He was insisting that it be read honestly. Baruch Spinoza published the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in Amsterdam in 1670. He published it anonymously, under a false publisher's name, with a false city of publication on the title page. He was not being paranoid. He had already been excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656 at the age of 23, with a harem of unusual severity understood to relate to his heterodox views on Scripture. He knew what happened to people who said openly what he was prepared to say. What he said in the Tractatus was essentially this: the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, was not written by Moses. It was compiled from multiple older human sources by human editors with political and religious purposes of their own. This analysis, which modern scholarship calls the documentary hypothesis, was not formally developed and widely accepted until the 19th century. Spinoza was 200 years early. And the core of his method was simple. Read Scripture as you would read any other ancient document. Ask who wrote it, for what audience, in what historical context, and for what purpose. The question is not, did a baby float in a basket on the Nile? The question is, why would Israelite scribes in 6th century Babylon, compiling the Exodus narrative from their available literary and oral sources, use the exposed hero template, the same template used for Sargon of Akkad, used for Horus hidden in the reeds by Isis, used in dozens of other royal legitimation stories across the ancient Near East? Why the basket? Why the bitumen? Why the discovery by a figure of power? Spinoza would answer, because that was the literary language of greatness that their historical moment recognized. When you wanted your audience to understand that a man was inevitable, that his greatness was not incidental but built into the structure of things from the beginning, you told his story using the exposed hero template. It was not plagiarism in the modern sense. It was not deception. It was the activation of a known literary form in service of a claim about a man your tradition had decided was indispensable. I remember the afternoon I understood this properly. It was winter in Norwich, that particular grey persistence of East Anglian January, where the light is flat all day and the cold is damp rather than sharp. By 3 in the afternoon, the desk lamp was on, I had two texts open side by side, a scholarly translation of the Sargon legend from the cuneiform and Exodus chapter 2 in Hebrew, with a lexicon for the words that mattered. The word kupru on the left, the word zift on the right. The same substance in two different languages, separated by centuries and by civilizations, sitting 3 inches apart on a desk in Norfolk. I had heard the Moses basket story in Anglican services I could not count, in theology lectures, in seminars, in sermons at Durham Cathedral when I was a graduate student. It was not a story I was discovering. It was a story I thought I knew. And what I felt reading those two texts side by side was not the loss of something. It was the recognition of having been educated, carefully, thoroughly, respectably educated, in a way that did not include the question of dates. Nobody had told me the Moses basket story was false. Nobody needed to. They had simply never mentioned that a structurally identical story about a king named Sargon had existed in the Mesopotamian literary tradition before the Exodus narrative was compiled. The question had been left out of the syllabus, and you do not miss what was never put there. Spinoza spent his short adult life in the gap between what the text says and what people are permitted to ask about the text. That gap is narrower now than it was in 1670, but it is not closed. Here is what makes the Sargon-Moses comparison more than an interesting academic note, more than a footnote in a comparative religion survey, more than something to file away and not disturb. Coincidence is a real phenomenon. Two cultures, two rivers, similar stories about children in baskets. One could argue for independent development. Maybe the reed basket is simply a practical object near rivers. Maybe bitumen sealing is a material obvious enough in a Mesopotamian context that multiple traditions would arrive at it independently. Maybe the river as a narrative element is universal enough not to require explanation. But coincidence as an explanation collapses under the weight of 8 specific elements in identical sequence. The bitumen detail alone should give any careful reader pause. Bitumen is not the obvious waterproofing material for a small woven basket in an Egyptian context. It is a Mesopotamian product, naturally occurring in seeps near the Tigris and Euphrates river systems, used in Mesopotamian construction, Mesopotamian waterproofing, Mesopotamian everyday life. It is not a material you would instinctively reach for if your frame of reference was the Nile Delta. It is a material you would know if your literary tradition was rooted in Mesopotamia, if your scribes were working in Babylon, if the exiles who were compiling your foundational texts were surrounded for decades by a culture in which bitumen was as ordinary as mortar. The Hebrew word for it in Exodus, when zift, appears only rarely in the biblical text. When it appears in the Moses story, it is not incidental detail. It is a signature, a trace of the hand that wrote from within a Mesopotamian literary world, a trace that points clearly and without ambiguity toward the direction of influence. Donald Redford in Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times, published by Princeton University Press in 1992, formally compared both birth narratives and concluded that the structural dependency was unmistakable. Redford went further. He identified a second convergence, the tradition of Horus hidden in the papyrus marshes by Isis, protected by water to emerge as the divine king. Moses stands at the intersection of two separate traditions of the hero preserved by water. The Mesopotamian exposed hero template from the east, and the Egyptian Horus tradition embedded in the very setting of the story. This is not a fringe argument. It is mainstream academic scholarship, available in any university library. It is not hidden in the sense of being actively suppressed. It is hidden in the sense of not being taught in confirmation classes, not appearing in sermon preparation guides, not mentioned in Sunday school curricula. Brian Lewis spent years cataloging those 72 exposed hero narratives. When he finished, he had a pattern, and the pattern is this. In every single case, every one of those 72 stories, the exposed hero template serves one consistent function. It does not simply describe a miraculous birth. It retroactively declares a leader inevitable. The river could not drown him. The powerful woman could not ignore him. From the very beginning, he was going to be this. He could not have been otherwise. That is what the template does. Not biography, legitimation. And if the Moses basket story is functioning as legitimation using the standard literary tools of antiquity, then what Spinoza asks next is the question the institutional church has been carefully not answering for 3.5 centuries. The birth of Moses in Exodus is not incidental. It is foundational. It is the opening argument for his divine election. The text is making a claim. God did not choose Moses at the burning bush. God's choice was present before the basket touched the water. The preservation of the child in the reeds is the signature of divine intent, written into events before Moses could speak, before he could act, before he had done anything at all to earn it. Not a survival story, a theological argument. This is precisely the weight that Spinoza's method, applied carefully, begins to redistribute. If the birth narrative is a political literary construction, if it uses the exposed hero template that Mesopotamian tradition had established as the standard form for declaring a leader's greatness, then the divine choice is not in the events themselves. It is in the text that was constructed to assert the choice. The hand of God in the basket is not a historical claim. It is a literary move. The same move that Sargon of Akkad's legend writers had made for their king. The same move that 72 other storytellers had made for 72 other figures across the ancient Near East. What Spinoza understood, and what the institutions he spent his life contending with could not acknowledge without consequence, is that when the same argument works for 72 different figures, the argument is not evidence of selection. It is evidence of a literary convention. Spinoza read the Pentateuch the way a historian reads it, not asking what does this reveal about God, but asking what does this reveal about the people who wrote it and why they wrote it this way. The scribes who compiled Exodus in 6th or 5th century Babylon were not recording divine dictation. They were doing what skilled writers in any era do, reaching for the most powerful available language to say what they needed to say about a man their tradition regarded as the founding figure of their covenant relationship with God. That is not cynical. In some ways, it is more human than the claim it replaces, but it means something very specific for the claim of divine uniqueness. I was at an academic conference, somewhere in the north of England, late autumn, the kind of gathering at a university campus where the heating has not quite caught up with the season and the conversations in corridors are better than the papers. I had just heard a presentation on Mesopotamian influence and the Exodus redaction, delivered in the careful, hedged language of academic publication, good scholarship that was walking very carefully around its own most significant implications. Afterward, in the corridor during the break, I spoke with one of the senior specialists in ancient Near Eastern literature, published work spanning 3 decades. I mentioned the Sargon-Moses comparison almost in passing. For me, it had long since moved from discovery to settled intellectual furniture. He didn't blink. He responded with the mild, slightly deflating patience of someone who has been here before. The comparison was undergraduate knowledge, he said. Any second-year student in Near Eastern studies would recognize the structural parallels. It was not contested. It was simply part of the established academic picture of how the Exodus narrative was composed. I asked him why it didn't appear in standard sermon preparation materials, why it wasn't part of what English clergy were equipped with when they stood up to preach on the Moses basket story at Easter. He looked down the corridor for a moment. The tea was cold and bad. He looked back at me. Because, he said, the people who write sermon preparation guides are not answerable to the University of Chicago Press. Then he picked up his cup and moved toward the next session. And I stood in that corridor for a minute, with the old carpet under my feet and the muffled sound of the next paper beginning through a closed door. And I thought about all the sermons I had sat through, and all the theology seminars I had attended, and all the places where this comparison had simply not come up, where the date had not been mentioned, where the tablet in the British Museum had not been brought into the room. The specialist had said it was undergraduate knowledge, not even controversial, and yet it had not been in any of the theology teaching I had received across a decade of formal education. Not once, not a footnote. Spinoza understood this mechanism. The suppression of inconvenient questions is not always dramatic. It is usually quiet, accomplished not through force but through omission, through what is simply not included in the syllabus. Let me tell you what Spinoza actually concluded. Not the sensationalized version, not the reading that says Spinoza was attacking Moses, that he was dismantling religion for the pleasure of it. That reading is wrong. What Spinoza concluded was this: the human hand in the text does not make the text worthless. It makes it human, and human things, honestly examined, are more durable than things propped up by claims they cannot survive. Moses is not diminished by the recognition that his birth narrative uses a well-established ancient literary template. What remains is everything that cannot be dissolved by historical method: the ethical teaching, the legal tradition, the formative power of the Exodus narrative in shaping a people's understanding of liberation, justice, and obligation. Those things survive entirely. They do not need the birth narrative to be historically unique. What does not survive is a narrower claim that the Moses birth narrative proves divine selection through miraculous preservation, a selection unique in human history, independent of any human literary construction. That claim does not survive, and here is what Spinoza understood that the institutions around him could not acknowledge. That claim was never in the original text. It is an institutional claim, built on top of the text by centuries of theological interpretation that did not find it useful to mention the tablet in the British Museum, or the 72 other exposed heroes, or the Akkadian word kupru, and the Hebrew word zift pointing at each other across 3,000 years of textual tradition. The text says, here is what happened. The institution says, and this proves that Moses was uniquely chosen by God. Those are two different statements. The first is in the manuscript. The second is in the apparatus built around the manuscript. And Spinoza spent his working life drawing that distinction at personal cost in a city that was more tolerant of heterodox ideas than almost anywhere else in Europe at the time, and which still found his conclusions barely tolerable. There is one thing left I want to say. The thing that carries the most weight in this entire conversation. When Spinoza read the Moses basket story and recognized the human hand in it, recognized the editors, the literary conventions, the political religious purposes of the scribes working in Babylon, he did not describe what he found as a fraud. He described it as an act of construction. Human beings, working with the literary materials available to them in a specific historical moment, reaching for the most powerful language to say what they needed to say about a man they regarded as indispensable to the story of their people. That is what writers do. That is what all of us do when we want to say something that matters, and we reach for the form that will carry it. The exposed hero template was not unique to Mesopotamia. It was universal precisely because the need it serves is universal. The need to say this person was always going to be the one. The question Spinoza asks, and the question I have spent a great deal of my working life sitting with, is not whether that act is sacred. The question is whether we are allowed to look at it honestly, whether the date on the tablet in the British Museum belongs in the room when we talk about Moses, whether a scholar can stand in a corridor at a conference in the north of England and say in plain language that this is undergraduate knowledge, and whether that plain language is then allowed to travel further than that corridor. Spinoza thought it should. He said so at personal cost in 1670, under a false name, in a city that was more tolerant of heterodox ideas than almost anywhere else in Europe at the time, and which still barely tolerated him. I think he was right. Not because knowing it destroys anything worth keeping, but because a faith that cannot look honestly at its own construction is not stronger for the avoidance. It is only more fragile, dependent on the continued absence of a clay tablet from the conversation. That tablet has been in the British Museum for a long time now. It is not going anywhere. And the river, as Sargon's legend says, rose not over him. Nor, I think, will it rise over the questions Spinoza spent his life asking.
Hey, I'm Daniel. I spent 20 years as a professor of religious history. Then I discovered something that cost me my career, but I couldn't keep it to myself. What Spinoza found, it changes everything you think you know.